Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Devin Sears. I am joined by my friend and colleague, Chris David Miles. He has joined us many times for webinars, so if you've been here before and learned from him before, then you know you are in for a treat. He has a lot of knowledge when it comes to WordPress and building websites and how to do it effectively and efficiently. So we're going to jump in. Today, we're talking about plugins. As I mentioned, we have Chris David Miles joining us. He is our Senior Technical Product Manager, constantly working on the WordPress products with Bluehost, constantly working to make it a better product for our customers, and we are thrilled to have him here today. As I mentioned previously, my name is Devin Sears. I am the Field Marketing Manager for Bluehost, and I am excited to be here with you today. Before we jump into the content of today's webinar, I want to just cover our regular housekeeping items. First, if you can hear us, find the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. We always love to see where people join us from, and we also love to see that our audio is transmitting. That brings us to an important housekeeping item. If you are having any issues with the webinar platform, the best thing to do is to leave the webinar and to re-enter the webinar, essentially refreshing the page. That fixes 90% of the problems. If you're still having problems, feel free to message me in the chat. However, I am limited in how I can problem solve some of the issues that might arise, but I'll do the best that I can. If you are tuning in from a mobile device, then you do need to unmute the stream. This comes up every single time we do a webinar. People say they have a hard time hearing the audio. If you're tuning in from a mobile device, just find somewhere on the feed. There should be a small mute button that you can click, and that should get you the audio. Please, if you found the chat box, hopefully next to that you see that there's a Q&A section. As we go through the webinar, please don't hesitate to ask questions. I will be off screen doing my best to answer all the questions that come up. And if there are any that I don't know the answer to or that I think will be beneficial for the larger group, then I will hold those to the end of the webinar, and we will have a Q&A section with Chris. So if you do ask a question in the chat, if it's an easy question to answer, I'll probably just respond there. If it's a little bit more difficult or might be more involved, I might move it to the Q&A section just so that we can have a threaded response. And I just call attention to this because occasionally I'll move it from chat to Q&A and people think that I'm deleting their questions. So I just want to let everyone know no questions are ever deleted. We just move them over to the Q&A section. Now, the last question that I'm going to preemptively answer before we jump into content is, yes, this is being recorded, and yes, we will send out a copy of the recording to everyone that registered for the webinar. So if you're tuning in today, then you've already registered, obviously, and we will send out a recording in 24 to 48 hours of this webinar. So we're excited to have you with us today. We hope that you learn from this. We hold these so that you can be educated and so that you can view Bluehost as a partner in the website building process. That's important to us. That's one of the reasons why we hold these webinars, is that we can be there with you and to answer your questions, and so that we can demystify some of the chaos that can occasionally surround building a website. So what are we covering today? We're going to talk about plugins. If you have not built a WordPress website before, then you might have tuned in to last month's webinar where we talked about themes a little bit. Themes are completely foundational to building a WordPress website, and hand in hand with themes comes plugins. Themes sets up the aesthetic of your website. It kind of establishes how your website is viewed by the users. And plugins enhance the functionality of a website. And Chris will get into this deeper, but just to give a quick preface, I like to view plugins as apps for your smartphone or items that you're taking on a long hike. And I'll get to that in the Q&A section if we have time on embellishing that analogy a little bit more. But first, Chris is going to teach us about what WordPress plugins are. Then we're going to get into how they impact the performance of your website. After that, we're going to walk you through how to install a plugin. And then once we teach you how to install a plugin, we're going to teach you how to evaluate the quality of a plugin. There's a lot of plugins out there on the open source, and especially with WordPress. So we want to make sure that you know how to evaluate whether or not this is the right plugin for your website. After that, we're going to get into plugin best practices, a couple tips and tricks just to make sure that you're using plugins to the best advantage that you can. And then after that, we're going to cover a couple popular plugin categories and just review some of the categories and some of the plugins that we have seen used time and time again. So they're either popular or very reliable, but we want to cover a couple of those. And then, as I mentioned previously, we will jump into a Q&A. So the one last thing I want to mention before I turn this over to you, Chris, we have gotten feedback in the past that staying in the slides too much can be confusing for someone that is doing this for the first time. So I have asked Chris and challenged Chris to spend as much time today within the WordPress admin area so that it is as close to a reflection of what you see as you're building your website as possible. As I mentioned before, it is important to us that we come across as a partner in the website building process. And so we want to make sure that you can come back and watch this at your leisure and make sure that what you're seeing in this webinar is the same as what you're seeing when you're trying to build your website. So without further ado, Chris, please take it away. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be off screen trying to answer as many questions as possible, but I will be back at the end. But until then, the time is yours, Chris.
Great. All right. Hopefully y'all can hear me. Can you tell me in chat if you can hear me? Okay. It sounds like it's working. Perfect. So understanding WordPress plugins. As Devin said, plugins are basically just a way to add functionality to your site. And so in this section, let's just talk about, hey, what are plugins? How do they actually work? What are some of the things that you'll think about, and why you need to be a little bit careful about what you do with plugins. So WordPress core is what we refer to the kind of base functionality of WordPress. So if you've got a website that's built in WordPress, there's the section that everybody can see, the kind of front end of the website, and there's the WP admin that only website administrators can see. Like if you're the owner of the website, then you're probably an administrator of the website. So that's like the back end. And so there's certain functionality that's just sort of automatically built into WordPress. Things like being able to publish posts, things like being able to edit the way that your site looks and things like that. And then there's some functionality that if you want something extra, you don't have to necessarily modify the code of your site. You can just add additional website code using plugins. And so you can use plugins to enhance things like the search engine optimization of your site or the security of your site, or more commonly, just change how things work a little bit more to your liking. And so as you, let me share my screen and I can kind of show you what I mean. So I am going to pop over to a site that I have. And here it is. So when I'm in WP admin, it kind of looks like this. There's different sections in the navigation that I can go to. And one of those sections is plugins, right? And plugins is where you can add extra functionality. So that's literally all this is there's the plugins section of WordPress, and there's a lot of different plugins that you can install, and these plugins add additional functionality or features or just change how WordPress works a little bit. So we're just going to go through and talk a little bit about what you should be thinking about when you're installing a plugin. We'll get more into evaluating whether plugins are any good a little later in the presentation, but as a basic overview, if you're one of the things you'll want to think about before installing a plugin is, first of all, whether or not a plugin is even really what you need. What you might find is you don't even need to a plugin to do what you want. You might have, like, say, a recipe website and be thinking, oh, well, maybe I need a recipe plugin. And maybe you do. But also, maybe you don't. Maybe it's possible just to write recipes and organize the blog the way you want without even really adding an extra plugin. You can just treat it like a blog post and make each recipe like a blog post or something like that. So you won't necessarily need plugins for every little thing. So one thing to keep in mind is, can this be done without adding anything to WordPress? Another thing to keep in mind is, as you're adding plugins, are they high quality? Is this a plugin that's really gonna help your site? And we'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate that later. Um, and another thing you'll want to think about is, who's publishing this plugin. Sometimes it's best, if you're looking at plugins that are by, kind of well-respected companies, or companies that um, have a lot of popular plugins on WordPress. That, hey, if it's particularly popular, it doesn't guarantee that it's exactly what you need, but it does give you an indication that at least many other people likely found some benefit from it. Um, so popularity is not necessarily a guarantee of quality, but it does tell you that this was valuable for a great many number of people. So those are just some things to try and keep in mind, as you're trying to think about, hey, how should I make this work with plugins? So that's basically it when it comes to what plugins are. Is it's just a way to add functionality. How plugins impact performance. This is one of the most common questions that I get, because one of the things that you have to think about, Devin, you used an analogy before that I really like, which is, imagine you're going on a hike and you're adding things to your backpack. The more you add to your backpack, it might slow you down a little bit. Now, it's not necessarily a guarantee that the number of plugins directly corresponds to how responsive or how performant or scalable your site is. In fact, some plugins will actually dramatically help the performance of your website. So it's more about the quality of the plugins you're bringing than it is about the number of plugins that you add. But it is something to consider, that if that generally speaking, the more you install, then just the more you have to think about, maybe the more area there is around things that you either would have to learn or keep up to date on. And so adding plugins is great, and adding functionality can be really beneficial. But if you're not using that functionality, or if you're not 100% sure if you even really need a plugin, you might remove it. So it's sort of just a question of trust. So performance plugins. Let's talk about that a little bit. One of the more common things that you can do with a plugin that's really popular is you can change the way that WordPress works so that certain aspects of loading pages is faster. This is especially useful in situations where you're using a hosting provider that isn't really super focused on WordPress. If it's just sort of like generic hosting, then yeah, you're probably going to need to find some plugins to sort of make up for that. If you're using a hosting provider that is very focused on WordPress, what you might find is that hosting provider either publishes their own kind of solution for performance, or it's sort of baked into the hosting itself. Where if you're using a popular and well trusted host that is very WordPress focused, you probably don't need to search around for a caching plugin on top of that. Caching is just a way to speed up certain types of requests to your site to make them faster. You probably don't need to search around for a caching plugin if your hosting provider already has caching set up for you out of the box. So like Bluehost is one, and there's many other very good hosting providers out there that just by nature of having a WordPress hosting package, all of that's going to be built into what you already have. It'll come with that out of the box. In the case of Bluehost, that's going to be the Bluehost plugin. And so any new site that you install will actually come with, let me share my screen. Any new site on Bluehost will actually come with the Bluehost plugin, which comes with functionality like caching, where you can and one of the things that this does is it will manage the cache for you. So you don't, if you're a Bluehost customer, you don't actually have to go out and find a caching plugin to install on top of it. And if you do, it's not going to help that much because this is already built into what we have by default. So, and this is also going to be true of many other very WordPress focused hosting providers, where if you're at DreamHost, if you're at SiteGround, you're going to want to use the caching plugins that they give you and kind of take the recommended advice that your host has for how to best do that. But if you're just sort of hosting it yourself, or if you're using some very generic hosting, then yeah, you might have to go out and find some very performance focused plugins for that. Going back to our presentation here. So the role of hosting providers in caching and site performance. If you're using a hosting provider that claims that they're good at WordPress, you shouldn't have to do too much to get your site to be fast. There's certainly best practices you can take, and I think we even have a webinar on that. But for the most part, the hosting providers should be able to set things up so that out of the box, you're able to be successful. What you might find is that depending on the amount of traffic you're anticipating you're going to get, you might have to get a larger or a smaller hosting plan, but they should be able to accommodate that. So to recap, there are plugins that can help with performance. Caching plugins certainly can do that. But if you're on a hosting provider that does a good job with that, they'll probably give you one out of the box, and you can kind of just look for that. How to install a plugin. So let's actually just get into a demonstration of that. So I'm going to share my screen once again, and we're going to jump into WP Admin, and we're going to look at that. So here I am on kind of a test website that I've been playing around with, and I'm going to go into WP Admin by clicking on the name of the site up here at the top left. And then over on the side, I'll find plugins in the list and add new plugin. I'll click on that. And then here I've got a page where I can just search for what I'm looking for. And so you can scroll through popular plugins and find many of the things that you might need, or you might search. But for the purposes of what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with Yoast SEO, which that's a search engine optimization plugin that I like to use. And so all I had to do to install that was click on the Install Now button. And then after a few seconds, that turns into another button for Activate, which when I click on, will activate the plugin. And now I've got a new menu option here for Yoast SEO. And I can start going through and setting up. So already it's noticed, hey, there's an SEO problem and we can fix it, right? And this is just a test website anyways. But to recap really quickly, you just go to plugins, add new plugin, you find the plugin you're looking for with search or by scrolling. You can click Install Now. And then after a few seconds, you can click Activate. And then there you go. That functionality is now a part of your website. That second one I did was health checks. Um, so it's really just as simple as that. You don't even really have to leave WP admin most of the time to get the plugin that you need installed and activated. Now we're going to do that in reverse, where if I want to turn off a plugin, what I can do is go to the plugin section here, and then I can go over and find deactivate. So here's deactivate, and if I click on that, then now health check is turned off. And I can just click delete, and now it's gone. So that kind of undid what I just did before. Depending on your hosting provider, sometimes they'll set things up that are necessary for your server to run well, and in those cases, sometimes you can't deactivate or delete them. But for the most part, any plugin that you add, you can remove. So let's go back to our slideshow presentation now. That's how to install a plugin. But I kind of glossed over a very important part of this, which is find the plugin that you want. That's easier said than done. So evaluating plugin quality, it's a thing we're going to want to do. So there's a number of kind of signals that you can look at. You don't necessarily have to be an expert to pick this out, but there's a number of things you can do to try and decide whether or not a particular plugin is going to do a good job at what you need and is going to be good for what kind of solve the problem you're looking to solve. So the questions that you can ask are, how often is this plugin updated? If this is something that was written 10 years ago and hasn't changed since, maybe it's still okay, but there's a chance it's not. And if it was only recently updated, well, then that's probably a pretty good sign that the maintainer of this plugin is kind of keeping up with things. What kind of support is available? We'll get into that. Has it been tested with the latest version of WordPress? So plugins have versions. There's multiple versions of them, and WordPress has multiple versions. And there's a really easy way you can make sure that the version of a plugin you're using is supposed to be compatible with a version of WordPress you're using. So we'll get into that and some other things like that. But before I go too deep into slideshow land, let's just show off what some of these things are. So starting again here, when I'm going to add a new plugin, if I'm looking for recipes, like remember we talked about recipes as an example here, you don't actually need a plugin to publish recipes on your site. You can just type them out like a blog post, but you might want a recipe for certain extra functionality. And so as I'm looking through this, maybe one of the things I'm looking at here, if we go through our list of things to do, is I can click on the title here of a plugin, and it'll give me more information. So if I click on this, I'll be given all this extra information. Here's some things to look at, right? For one thing, read through the description. It'll tell you everything usually that the plugin does. And it's sort of a sales pitch for, hey, here's why this plugin might be a good choice for you. You can also look at when was it last updated? Only 2 days ago. That's pretty good. So that means probably this plugin is being maintained by either a team of people or the person that maintained it. There's also ratings that people can give, and mostly 5-star ratings. This looks like a lot of people thought this was a pretty good plugin. You can also, there's compatibility versions and things like that, but luckily WordPress does a lot of that for you. So one of the things you can look at here is you can say, now down here, it's compatible with your version of WordPress. So that's good news. If I scroll through, it looks like many of these are, but here's one. that, and sorry for this one that I'm sort of picking on here, but this was last updated 6 months ago and appears to be untested with this version of WordPress. So one of the things that plugin creators can do is plugin creators can actually write into their plugin information what versions of WordPress this plugin has been tested against. And it just, all it takes is 5 minutes for the developer to say, I've tested with this version, and then that gets published everywhere in the world. So it isn't a lot of work to say, hey, I'm compatible. So if that hasn't happened, that's probably not a good sign. That probably means that this isn't on the author of this plugin hasn't taken 5 minutes to say, hey, yes, this is compatible, and hasn't thoroughly tested it yet. So that's another thing to keep in mind is is it compatible? And it'll tell you right here on this screen if it is. Another one is support. So when I click on one of these, one of the things that I can look at here, over here where it says WordPress.org plugin page, if I click on that, I'm getting now the plugins page on WordPress.org, and I can scroll down and look at the support form, and it'll tell me, hey, how many support tickets for this have been closed in the last 2 months. And I can even click on this and look at some, and it'll give me an idea of what sort of questions are people asking, and are people getting answers to them, which might be a good indicator of whether or not this plugin is well maintained. And it might be an indicator of what kind of support you might get if you have questions. If you pop in here and you see lots and lots and lots of questions and nobody answering them, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad plugin, but it probably tells you that if you asked a question there, you wouldn't see an answer. But yeah, and for any plugin on WordPress.org, there's kind of this built-in support forum where you can ask questions, and if the author of the plugin wants to, they can answer them, and oftentimes they do, but it's something to check for. And of course, you can also look at the reviews and the ratings. It looks like mostly 5 stars for this plugin, which is pretty good. 4 or 5 stars, probably primarily what you want. There's also 50,000 people about or more are currently actively using this plugin. So if I was going to compare all of these different options, this seems like a pretty good one. This being said, I've completely skipped over what specifically the plugin does, which is probably the most important thing. And for that, you're just going to want to read through the description and see if it looks like it's going to solve your problem. Now to install, I just click Install Now. And then I'll get an Activate button a few seconds later. And there we go. Now we've got a new option right here in the side for WP Recipe Maker. And there we go. Now I'm not going to demonstrate that. I'm just talking about plugins generally. But yeah, so that's generally how that goes. Let's jump back to our slides here. So those are some of the ways you can evaluate the quality of a plugin. What are some plugin best practices? So one of the things you might find is after you install a plugin, some plugins will add a new menu item, kind of like how before we talked about it. We installed 2 plugins and it added 2 new menu items. Not all of them do that. Sometimes you have to hunt around a little bit in the menu to find what's been added. Sometimes it's a really, really simple, straightforward plugin that doesn't do much. So it might not add a menu item at all. So one of the things you can do, let me share my screen. One of the things you can do is in here, when you go and add a plugin, that kind of description here that describes what it does, this is very likely to give you all the information you need on how to use it, or at least where to get started. Be that, oh, maybe it's a new menu item over here, or maybe it's just something that's going to come up when you're editing your post, or maybe it does this or that. But depending on what the plugin does, you might see a new menu item on the left-hand side, or it might be buried in tools or settings, or it might be somewhere else. But if the answer isn't here in the description, and you're still sort of confused, you can look at the plugin page and see if the answer's there. Or kind of as a last resort, you can even ask the developer on the WordPress.org plugin page, hey, how do I use this? But oftentimes you can just see right here in the screenshots what it is that you're supposed to do and what sort of functionality it adds. And sometimes there's links here to additional reading material where you can learn more about the plugin. Where to find help. We talked about the support form that's kind of built in. Let's talk a little bit about automatic updates. So one of the things that's built into WordPress that's really nice is updates are sort of built in to where if I've got a version of a plugin that's, let's say, like a version old or something like that, I'll actually have the opportunity to update it. And so if I, let's do this. I'll actually have an opportunity to update it. And so that can happen automatically as long as it's turned on. And what you'll have to do sometimes is you can make sure that automatic updates here on the right-hand side either say are turned on or they'll say they're managed by your hosting provider. And so for Bluehost customers, it's really straightforward. What you do is you go in here to Bluehost on the top left, and then over here to settings. And then you're just going to want to make sure that auto updates are turned on right here. Automatically keep up to date. Now what this is going to do for you is it's going to make sure that you always have kind of the latest version of each of these plugins. It means that when there's a security update or new functionality, you just sort of get that automatically. And so you don't have to wait around for you to notice that this happens. It can just automatically happen. And it can really, really be an important way to protect your site from security problems and things like that, is that you're always running kind of the latest and greatest version of a plugin. Going back to this, test in staging. We'll get through this quickly, but one of the things that you can do is you can actually, if you're unsure of which plugin you want to use, one of the things you can do, at least at Bluehost, is you can actually create what are called staging copies of sites, which is basically you can make a copy of a site that nobody but you can see. And then with that copy, you can make whatever changes you want and not worry about messing up the real website. So for Bluehost, it's really easy. I just go over here to the top. I click on the Bluehost logo. I scroll down to staging and then create staging site. So the reason I'm doing this is if I'm not sure what plugin I want to install, maybe I want to try out like 5 different recipe plugins and see which one I really like. I don't really want to do that on my important live website. I would much rather do that on a copy of a site where it doesn't matter if things go terribly wrong. So I just went ahead and made that copy. Now we're going to switch over to it. Staging, and it'll say, hey, this is going to take you to a staging environment. I'll go ahead and switch over. And then here we are in a staging copy of the site. So this is actually a completely new, different version of my site. I can do whatever I want to this copy, and it won't impact the real thing. So now I can go over here to plugins, and I can kind of install whatever I want. Let's see. I'm gonna, and I can change things. I can deactivate things. I can make really whatever changes I want. So I'm gonna go in here, and I'm gonna add several recipe website plugins. Excuse me. So Recipe Maker is the one we kind of picked before, but I can add more. WP Delicious. Let's go ahead and install that and activate it. And there we go. Now it's going to try and get me to set this up. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to go back and install some more. So I can just keep adding more and more. And then I don't have to guess quite as much because I can just install all of these different recipe plugins, multiple at a time, kind of try out which ones I like. And then if I ultimately like one more than another, then I'll only install that one on my real website. And so I can actually just test this out and see what happens. So for this, I'll go over and say, I can do multiple at once. I can say Blossom Recipe Maker, Recipe Management, Recipe, all these different ones. And under bulk actions, I can say activate, and I can activate all of them at the same time. And so now I've got several new options here. I've got Blossom Recipes, WP Delicious, Recipe Cards, WP Recipe Maker. The list goes on, right? I can try all these out, and I don't have to worry about all this extra stuff going on because remember, this is only like my staging kind of fake copy of my site. And so when I've decided, okay, I know which one I'm going to use, I can pop back over to the production site and say, okay, now I know what I'm going to use. And I only had to do that on my staging site. So it's really easy. It's really simple. So the reason we did staging is I can really just go crazy on the staging site and do whatever I want to do. And when I'm done with it, hey, now I know a little bit more about these recipe plugins because I've installed them and played around with them and I made a decision about which one I want. I can just delete this staging site now and it just goes away. And I never have to worry about it. I don't have to clean it up. I just delete it, walk away, never think about it again. So easy. So yeah, that's kind of the idea there with staging is do all your testing there, and then you don't have to worry about messing things up in real life. Popular plugin categories. Okay, we're going to kind of whiz through this because there's different things that we can do. But here's some of the sections that we can just talk about which plugins are popular here. So I'm going to pop back into WP Admin and just go through some of these. So our popular categories are starting with SEO. Now, it's no secret, I'm a big fan of Yoast SEO. Yoast, as of a few years ago, actually joined forces with Bluehost, and they're now the same company. That didn't used to be the case. And I've been a fan of Yoast SEO for years, even before they were the same as Bluehost. But they're actually the same company now. But you don't have to use Yoast. There's a lot of different ones out there that you can use. And so, if I search for SEO, there's a number of different options here. One thing you might want to consider if you're looking at kind of the different options that are available to you is there's Yoast SEO, the free version, and there's also something called Yoast SEO Premium. And that gives you a little bit more of an edge and a little bit more features here. So things like it uses AI to give you to generate titles and descriptions for your posts, which might save you a little bit of time. Instead of only getting one keyword per page, you can have up to 5. It does this really clever thing where it can automatically set up redirects for you. Where if you've got an old page that you've either deleted or that used to be there and no longer is, you can have it set up so that it automatically redirects old ones to new ones when you rename them. So that's pretty cool. There's a whole bunch of extra stuff. It comes with extra support, but you also have to pay for it. But yeah, you don't even have to leave. You don't even have to leave your WP admin to get that. If you're a Bluehost customer, you can just pop right into what we call the marketplace. So it's right here in Bluehost and then marketplace. And you can actually just buy Yoast SEO just right here. And it's really easy. But yeah, there's a number of SEO plugins you can use. Yoast does a really good job. The free version is really great. The paid version is even better. E-commerce plugins, that's another category. So WooCommerce is definitely what I would recommend if you're trying to do a store. WooCommerce can give you virtually everything you need for the absolute basics of setting up a store. So things like a cart, things like payment gateways and things like that. Now, if you sign up with Bluehost, we can actually give you a lot of really cool functionality on top of that, where we can give you things like, in addition to that, you can set up gift cards. You can set up wish lists, special search and filtering, like how you get on like Amazon and stuff. You can set up bookings and appointments, all kinds of extra stuff that's really, really useful if you have a store. The basics of WooCommerce are available for free, but the extra functionality where you can set up things like wish lists and things like that are something that come with the WooCommerce plans at Bluehost. Another really cool thing you can do if you're a Bluehost customer is there's something called sales and promotions. So you can actually run campaigns and sales right here on your site. So like a buy one, get one free, or frequently bought together, or a little upsell modal, or all kinds of fun little things like that that you've probably seen on other e-commerce sites. And it's really, really easy to set up. Normally, you'd have to set up lots of complicated plugins to get this to work. And in this case, it's really straightforward. You can just set up these campaigns, and they live right here in your Bluehost plugin. And that just comes included in every WooCommerce plan that we sell. It's a really good value. That being said, you don't have to use our stuff. You don't even have to use Bluehost. So there's a lot of plugins out there, and you can, if you want, go and find some other wish list plugin and see if it's compatible. Gith is the one that we use here at Bluehost, but there's others out there. And so, like, as you're clicking through, just try and figure out what is it that you're trying to accomplish, what is the functionality you're looking for, and is this is this going to accomplish what I'm looking for? And in this case, Yith WooCommerce Wishlist is the one that we're offering. It's got great reviews. It's got 900,000 active installations. It's a really good solution. Performance plugins is another category. We kind of already talked about that a bit, where if your host is doing a good job, you probably don't need a whole bunch of extra plugins and things like that. But if you are on a host that's not really geared toward WordPress, you might have to find a caching plugin, and you might have to do something like install W3 Total Cache or WP Super Cache or something like that. Like if you're hosting this on your own hardware, like in your house, then yeah, you might have to do something like that. But I would recommend finding a good managed WordPress solution where you don't have to worry about really complicated caching plugins. Jetpack is another good one that I normally recommend. Um, the thing that I like about Jetpack is it does a lot of things, but you don't have to use all of those things, and you can actually turn on and off individual aspects of Jetpack. So things like downtime monitoring, where you can get an email if something goes wrong with your site and it goes down. It comes with a free firewall. Um, and for performance, it can speed up your images. It comes with a bunch of writing and social features. You can use it for comments in a way that will make your site a little bit more performant. There's a bunch of stuff that Jetpack comes with. It's probably worth checking out. All right, we're running low on time, so I'll just finish up quickly. Utility plugins. So these are just little miscellaneous knickknacks that you can add that are kind of fun. I will talk about some of my personal favorites. We already talked about Jetpack. Two-factor authentication is a good one. What this does is it lets you set up your login so that even if an attacker is able to guess your password, they still won't be able to get in because they need a secondary thing. So you can set up like a time-based codes that either get emailed to you or that you can see on your phone or something like that. So it just makes it that much harder for an attacker to get in. Slides and presentations is a fun plugin. What that does is it lets you do slideshows on a WordPress site. And you can actually use a WordPress site as like a PowerPoint presentation, which is really cool. Dashboard notes is a really fun one. That lets you add sticky notes to the dashboard of your site. And you can even share those sticky notes with other people who are admins of your site. And so if you want to add a sticky note, you can just install that plugin, click add note, and then you've got a little thing where I can make like maybe a to-do list. Finish the records for my blog. Pick out some good plugins for the webinar. And it's kind of fun. I can have this just be a private note that's just for me, or I can share it with everybody that's an admin of this site. So it's just a little bit of extra functionality, but it's kind of fun. I don't think I've talked about Cloudflare yet, but that's another really good one. Cloudflare is a security product that can protect your site from attacks and from hackers. And there's a free plugin that they publish that makes this work really well. I use it a lot. It's also just worth checking out Cloudflare. A lot of hosting providers partner with Cloudflare and will actually set it up for you automatically. Bluehost is one of those, but by no means are they the only one. There's a lot of really good ones out there. And Akismet is another really good one for anti-spam. So if you're a site that has comments turned on, you don't want to get a bunch of spam comments on your site. It's kind of a drag to look at, and it's a drag to have to deal with. Akismet does a really good job of filtering spam comments so that the worst spam you don't even have to see, and the ones it's unsure of, you can just manually check and it never shows up. There's a free tier of that for commercial sites. There's cheap plans of it, but it's a really, really good anti-spam solution that I would recommend. And that's sort of the short list of like some of personally my favorite plugins, but there's a lot of really good ones out there. And there's a lot of cool stuff you can do by adding plugins to your site. So hopefully this was helpful and you get kind of a basic overview of like plugins can add functionality to your site. You can add plugins to your site right here in WP Admin. You can judge whether or not a plugin is any good by looking at things like if it's compatible with the latest version of WordPress, how many installs there are, things like that. And there's a lot of plugins out there that can do a lot of cool things for your site. And that's, I think, everything I had in kind of this introduction to enhancing your site with plugins. So that's everything I had here. We might want to go over to Q&A now, which
Awesome.
looks like we've had a lot of questions.
Thank you. All right, let's jump into it. We've got a list of questions here. I'm just going to start from the top and jump into it. But first, allow me to express my gratitude for you sharing your knowledge and your information with us today. We've got a little bit of time for some Q&A. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. So first question up asks, how do I determine which plugin is best for the specific functionality I need on my WordPress site?
Okay. So sometimes you just got to test it out. Sometimes that's the best way to do it, to where it might not be obvious up front which plugin is going to do, the best job. But if you read reviews of what people are saying, it can help. And sometimes you just got to test it out and see, does it do what you want it to do? We talked about it's good to use staging sites so that there's less risk, and you can kind of just install several, see which one you like, and then delete the staging site. And once you've made a decision, do that. But sometimes you just got to test it out and try and see.
Awesome. The next question is, the theme that I installed comes with some plugins. Should I install those? It looks like they're suggesting the theme they installed suggested they install a bunch of plugins.
Sometimes you can. Sometimes it's necessary for the theme to work the way it was designed. Sometimes it's not. So it really just depends. Sometimes you'll see required plugins and recommended plugins, and that can kind of answer the question a little bit. But it really just depends on what it is. Ideally, a really good block theme, modern theme, shouldn't require too many extra plugins to work. It should pretty much out of the box do everything it needs to do. But sometimes if it's like a multi-purpose theme or a theme with a lot of functionality in it, sometimes it does come bundled with certain things. Also, sometimes you'll find certain like patterns that it comes with are designed for certain plugins. Like maybe it has a contact form that's really pretty and it's designed for a certain plugin. So you can, but you'll probably want to test it out and see if it's really required or not.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that most on the premium themes. If someone's getting photography theme or something like that, maybe it'll come with like a carousel plugin or something like that, or like a gateway plugin so that you can send your photography packages to your clients without just publishing them on the website. So, but yeah, I completely agree with what you said. Next question here. What are the risks associated with installing too many plugins on my WordPress website?
Well, again, it's not really about the number of plugins. It's more about the quality. So you can have 50 plugins on a site and still have a fast website. It's about, are they good plugins? And are they plugins that should be there? But generally speaking, if you don't need a plugin, get rid of it. Unless it was added by, sometimes if you're not sure if it was added by somebody you trust, like maybe this site was built for you by somebody else, or maybe it's something that was added by your hosting provider to make sure that your site works really well. That can sometimes be necessary. It just depends. But like, for the most part, if this is a plugin that you added and you're not really sure if you really need it, try removing it and see if everything still works. That's my advice.
Yeah, and I know that you touched on it, and I mentioned it at the beginning. Plugins, I feel like, are you're loading up your backpack for a backpacking trip, right? So it's like you're going to be spending a week in the woods. What should you bring? Well, a tent is probably worth the weight. It might weigh a little bit in your backpack, but it's probably useful. Maybe the cast iron. cast iron pan or maybe the PlayStation 5, those might not be worth the wait. Those are great in their own way, but probably don't need to bring them. So I think a lot of it is trying to find that balance of, does it add value to my website? Is it kind of worth the wait, so to speak?
Yes.
Okay. The next question, what should I do if a plugin breaks my site? Ooh, and maybe I'll add my own secondary part of that is, how do I identify if a plugin broke my site?
Yeah. So one of the things you can do is, if you look in the logs on the server, and your host can help you do this. If you look in the logs on the server, if a plugin is breaking something and like nothing on the website loads, lots of times in the logs it'll tell you which plugin it is. It'll say an error occurred in like a certain area or a section of the code that is specific to a plugin. Another thing you can do is you can just turn off plugins and turn them on kind of one at a time and see, does the problem go away? And you can kind of narrow down which plugin it is. But once you know which plugin it is, if it's causing a problem, turn it off and maybe find a better one to do that, or see if you can get by without that plugin at all.
I like it. Give me 1 second. Let me pull up the next question. Let's see. What's the difference between a free plugin and a paid plugin? And are the paid plugins worth the cost? Another great question.
Okay. Some are, but it depends on what you need, right? Like I was talking before about Yoast SEO has a free tier and a paid tier. For some people, the free tier is all they need. So it depends on what it is that you need. And a paid plugin doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better than a free one. It just means that there's something in there that some people are willing to pay for. And that's how plugin authors oftentimes will maintain kind of the business side of what they're doing, is they'll put out like a free version and then have a paid version that some people pay for. Just make sure it's a reputable one, right? Just because it's paid doesn't necessarily mean it's any good. There's a lot of paid plugin and theme stores out there that just have a lot of junk, frankly. And so make sure it's good. It comes from a reputable company, a reputable source, and see if there's a way that you can do it. If you're looking to save some money with a free plugin, just keep in mind, sometimes what you're paying for is time savings, and if that's the case, sometimes it's worth it. But it just depends on what you need and what the premium plugin is offering you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of plugins will use the freemium model, right, where they give you some functionality of the plugin, and then if you pay, that unlocks the full functionality of the plugin. So I think that's a fairly common model. Okay, one question, I think we'll probably end on this one, to be honest. How can I check if a plugin is compatible with my current WordPress version?
Well, that's kind of what we talked about, where if you're installing it from WordPress.org, it will tell you right there if it's been tested with the latest version. Now, the author is who's claiming that, so we're still relying on them being correct. But if it's a very popular plugin, then there's a good chance that that's something that many other people have also tried and had success with.
Okay. Since you kind of covered that already, let's end on one more. And I'm actually going to try to compile 2 questions that I'm seeing here. There's a lot of questions, and sadly we can't get to all of them, but we will do our best to follow up with the people whose questions were not answered. Someone said, I found a plugin I want to use, but there's no support questions. Is that good or bad? And I'm mush this together with another question, which is, what should I look for in the plugin reviews and ratings before installing it? So how do I tell if it's good or bad, essentially?
If there's no questions at all, it might be a very simple plugin that doesn't do much, and nobody had questions so far. Or maybe it's just not popular enough that people have asked questions yet. So look at how many installs there are. But if it's got a lot of installs, you might be the first person to ask that question, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're seeing a lot of unanswered questions, that's probably not good.
I like it. All right, my friend, we are at time for today. So I appreciate you coming by and sharing your experience and knowledge with us as always. This has been helpful. I hope this is helpful for the audience. As usual, I like to end by asking the audience if there's a topic that you'd like to see us cover in the future, please drop it in the chat now. As I mentioned in the beginning, we want these to be educational and helpful for you. We want you to feel like you have a partner in building your website, and we want that partner to be found within Bluehost and within these webinars. So please take a moment, find the chat, drop a topic or two that you'd love to see covered in the future, and we'll do our best to cover that. So Chris, thank you again for stopping by, and thank you all for joining us. We'll talk to y'all soon.